On this lecture, we will discuss about lymphatics and immune system. Immune system is a very broad and deep subject, so we try to make it short for an anatomy class. At the end of this lecture, we should be able to understand the functions of the lymphatic system and the structure and distribution of lymphatic system. And where do we get lymph and how are they transported in the system? So lymphatic system involve vessels and lymph nodes. And let's start, where do we get lymph for the lymphatic system to carry? So at the end of our arterial capillaries and before the beginning of the small little veins, which we call venules, these capillaries become really thin out so that there is transfer of nutrients from the blood to the cells. During the transfer, there will be excess fluid leak in the periphery, and there might be large protein leak out from the capillaries. So some of the fluid will be taken away by the venules, but if there is any excess, the veins might not have the opportunity to take it back and carry inside the venous system in the circulation. So these excess fluid, large proteins, which cannot be carried by the venous system, they will be carried by the lymphatic system. So these small lymphatic capillaries will carry and collect excess fluid from the capillary level, from the periphery, and then they will be transferred along, they will be carried along the lymphatic system, along the collecting lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, lymph trunk, and lymph duct. And finally, all these will be returned to the circulation. And again, that will be transported into the arterial system. So this is the general distribution of the lymphatic system in our body. If you look at this, for the right side of the head and neck, and right thorax, as well as the right upper limb, they are color-coded with green, and the rest of the body is coded with pink color. What does it mean? Is the right side of the body, including right head and neck, right thorax, and right upper limb, the distribution and return of the lymph to this circulation is different. And on the left side, the whole body will finally enter and merge into one system, which we call thoracic duct. And finally, we drain into the large vein, which is a junction between the internal jugular vein and subclavian vein junction, as you can see in this diagram. So all the lymphatics from the right upper half will return in different way, and the rest of the body will return to the circulation in a different way via the thoracic duct. So let's start. So our circulatory system, which include arterial and venous system, let's say if we start from our heart, the heart will pump out blood, and arterial blood will go to every part of the body, and then finally get to the capillary level of the blood capillaries. There will be exchange from the blood capillary to the cell, and the oxygen, glucose from the blood capillaries will be delivered to the cell, and all the waste products such as carbon dioxide and urea, they will be carried into the vein, and then finally the veins will carry and send it back to the heart. That is the very closed system. And our lymphatic system go and mesh at the capillary level. So lymphatic capillaries will be mixing and meshing with the blood capillary, so that if there is any leakage or leftover, or those large molecules such as large proteins which cannot be carried back by the veins, venules, then lymphatic vessels will carry along and send it back into the venous system. So if you look at the hierarchy for the lymphatic system starts with the lymphatic capillaries. These lymphatic capillaries will finally become merged together to form collecting lymphatic vessels. And these vessels, the same like veins, they have valves. So these collecting lymph vessels will drain into the lymph nodes, multiple lymphatic vessels draining into the lymph nodes, and lymph node will filter the lymph. And then from the lymph node, they emerge and finally combine together to form lymph trunk, and lymph trunk will combine together to form lymphatic deck, and finally we drain into the big venous vessels, which are the largest vessels of the venous system, and finally we drain into the heart, and we return to the central circulation. So now our heart is going to pump out the blood into the arterial system, arterial circulation. Of course, it's at the beginning, the arteries will be large, which are large elastic arteries, and gradually these large arteries divide to become medium-sized or muscular arteries. And finally, they will become small little artery, which we call arterioles. And finally, they will become blood capillaries. And at this capillary level, there will be exchange, as we have said before, exchange of nutrients, exchange of waste products, and the blood capillaries will finally merge at the venous end to become small little veins, which we call venules. These venules will merge together to form small veins. Small veins become large veins, and finally veins will go back into the heart. And as we say, our lymphatic capillaries will be mixed and meshed with the blood capillaries around the cell. So let's look at this capillary level more closely. So this is the arterial side of the capillaries, venous side of the capillaries, and the cells are just around these capillaries. There will be exchange, and look at that, our lymphatic capillaries, they are also mix and mesh in between the blood capillaries, so that if there is any leftover or leakage from these transfer process between the capillary and cell, they will be picked up by the lymphatic capillaries. So this is the capillary level of the blood capillaries. As you can see, they are all lined by very thin layer, which is essentially a simple squamous epithelium, but of course we call that endothelium. And the cells around there will be exchange of oxygen and glucose, transfer of oxygen and glucose from the blood capillaries to the cells, and transfer of urea, waste products from the cell, and carbon dioxide back into the capillaries, and the blood continue to flow. So I'm going to introduce you 3 different types of blood capillaries. The first one is continuous capillaries. If you look at that, the capillary walls, which are really thin, as we said before, and these capillary walls are constructed with the flat, thin out cells, which is essentially simple squamous epithelium. But of course, in the blood vessel, we call endothelium. As you can see, multiple endothelial cells connect together to form the wall of the capillaries. And you can see the junction between the cells. And these capillaries, because endothelial cell, we have to rest on the connective tissue, which we call basement membrane. And there will be perisite, peri mean around, site mean cell, perisite around the cells. That is a form of capillaries, and you can see the junction between the endothelial cell. They are tight, and therefore we call it tight junctions. So what does it mean is there will be minimum transfer or minimum leakage from the intraluminal, so from inside the capillary out of the cell. So because of the minimal leakage, it will be good for us to use this type of capillaries where we do not want a lot of transfer, for example, like skin and muscles, or the blood capillaries in the brain. We will use this type of capillaries. So let's look at the next slide. Another type of capillaries, which are called fenestrated capillaries. Now you can start seeing small fenestrations in the endothelial cells. The junction in between the cells are still tight, but you start seeing small little pores, which we call fenestrations. Therefore, these capillaries are called fenestrated capillaries. Because of these fenestration, there must be more transfer from the intraluminal inside the capillary lumen to outside the cell. And therefore, this type of capillaries, we want to use it in side of the bodies where there should be some transfer, like absorption, filtration. And therefore, we will use this type of capillaries in kidneys and small intestine. Now look at this number 3 type of capillary, which is called sinusoid capillary. Now we can really see the fenestrations are really become large pores, and the junction between the endothelial cells are really wide. What does it mean is there will be a significant amount of transfer and exchange from the intraluminal, intracapillary to extracapillary. And therefore, this sort of capillaries will be used in significant exchange organ like liver, bone marrow, and spleen. So I have shown you 3 types of blood capillaries, and these blood capillaries can be mixed and meshed with the lymphatic capillaries. And therefore, let's look at the lymphatic capillaries. Hey, lymphatic capillaries are very different to some extent, but there are also many similarities. So look at here. The lymphatic capillaries, they start as a blind bulge. As you can appreciate, lymphatic system start from the cellular level and end when entering into the venous system. And therefore, it is only one-way system from the periphery to the systemic circulation. It is different from the main circulatory system, which start with the arteries and finally become capillaries and start again as venules and veins and finally go back into the heart. So that is a going in a cycle. But lymphatic system, it starts with the blind bulge. And as you can see here, the lymphatic capillaries are starting as a blind pouch. But the similarity is they are also made of endothelial cell, flat cells. And you can see one endothelial cell is resting on another, like our roof. Like one is resting on another, one is resting on another. And these endothelial cells are attached to surrounding connective tissue, surrounding cells and connective tissue via filaments. Here you can see that filaments coming from the connective tissue surrounding the lymphatic capillaries, and they are going attached to these endothelial cells. What does it mean if there is any contraction or movement of the connective tissue around the lymphatic capillaries? Then that way make the filaments contract and move. By doing so, the flap-like mini valves will open and the fluid around the capillaries can enter into the lymphatic capillaries. So lymphatic capillaries, they are lined by a single layer of squamous epithelium, of course squamous flat, but in the vascular system, we do not call squamous epithelium, we call it endothelium. They are located close to the blood capillaries, as we have seen in our previous slide. They are highly permeable structure, and they are arranged, as you can see with the filaments. The fluids could be easily enter into the lymphatic system, and fine collagen filaments anchor and which open the valves, mini valves. They will carry large protein, bacteria, viruses, and even the malignant cells. Of course, the lymphatic capillaries' job is to carry excessive fluid, which are pooled around the cell, which cannot be carried by the blood capillaries. And therefore, this lymphatic capillaries or lymphatic system will not be present in those which are highly regulated areas such as central nervous system, and those which are really solid structure like bone and teeth. There will be no lymphatics in the bone, teeth, bone marrow, and central nervous system. So at the moment, I want you to stop, take a break, and appreciate what you have learned. Now let's move on to the second part of the lecture. Let's start with the lymphatic system for the gastrointestinal tract. So they start with lacteals. Lymphatic vessels for the gastrointestinal tracts are called lacteals. Of course, they are starting in the villi of the intestinal mucosa. They will absorb digested fat as triglyceride, and they will be carried into the bloodstream. So if we eat fatty rich meal, they will be digested and absorbed from the intestinal mucosa villi, and as triglyceride, they will enter into the lymphatic system and they will be transported into the venous system. Because triglycerides, fatty acids, they look like milk, and therefore in Greek, milk is called chyle, and therefore the lymph from the gastrointestinal tract will be called chyle. So this is the diagram we have seen. We start with the gastrointestinal mucosa carrying chyle, and that will be taken from the lymphatic capillaries, and finally we go in, we march together to form lymphatic vessels, and these lymphatic vessels will finally go into the lymph node. Let's try to follow their pathway. So from the lymphatic pathway, start from the capillaries, and capillaries will march together to form collecting vessels. The superficial vessels will follow the veins, and deep vessels, lymphatic vessels, will follow the arteries. Of course, usually arteries are deep inside, underneath the muscles. And deep lymphatic vessels will follow the arteries. Still, the collecting vessels are still very thin-walled vessels, but now they start to have 3 layers, which are tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. So here I want you to introduce the structure of the vessels, for example, like veins, artery, and now we are talking about lymph collecting vessels. All these vessels, they are made of 3 layers, tunica intima, media, and tunica externa. In the lymphatic system, because it is coming from the periphery, from the cell level, there is no pump behind the lymphatic system. Like in arterial system, we have the beating heart, which is pushing the arterial blood into the arterial circulation with pressure. But in lymphatic system, we do not have such a pump, and therefore it is a low pressure system. So how do we propel these lymphatics from the periphery to the main venous system? Of course, when we contract our muscle contraction, we squeeze on the lymphatic vessels, and movement, arterial pulsation around the lymphatic vessels. We press on the lymphatic vessels and push the lymph towards the central. And as we remember, these collecting vessels have one-way valve, and there is no return. Tunica media, which is usually rich with muscle layer, they might have a role in squeezing back the lymph towards the venous circulation. So now from the capillaries, we are going through the collecting vessels, and now these collecting vessels will enter into the lymph nodes. So those vessels, collecting vessels, entering into the lymph node will be called afferent, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, afferent vessels. And after going through the lymph nodes and coming out from the lymph node, these vessels will be called efferent lymphatic vessels. Let's talk about lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are like kidney shape. It is about 1 millimeter to 2.5 centimeter diameter. The lymph nodes are the site of intersection between lymphatic system and immune system. Of course, the lymph node will be accepting all the lymph draining from the capillary, from the lymphatic vessels coming into the lymph node. It is going to filter these lymph. And at the same time, in the lymph nodes, we will have T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, which are part of the immune system. Lymph node, if we split the lymph node, we will have outer cortical layer and inner medullary layer, like the one we saw in our adrenal gland. There are a group of lymph nodes which will drain the particular part of the body. For example, like lymphatics from the head and neck will be draining into the superficial cervical lymph node group. The same thing, like upper lymphatics will be draining into the axillary lymph nodes, and lower limb lymphatics will be draining into the inguinal lymph node group. Trachea, bronchus will be draining into the mediastinal group, And those lymphatics from the posterior abdominal wall will be draining into the aortic lymph node group, and organs from pelvic organs will be draining into the iliac lymph node group. So these are the group of lymph nodes where they accept particular part of the body. Let's look at the lymph nodes. Now we can see the afferent lymphatic vessels entering into the lymph node, and after the filtration by the lymph nodes, the lymph will continue into the efferent lymphatic vessels here. And now we can see the outer connective tissue, which we call capsule. And these capsules will be entering into the lymph node by trying to separate as segments. These are called trabecules. And the cortex here, which is made of lymphoid follicles and germinal centers. And finally, the lymphatics will be sieved from the cortex and enter into the medulla, where we can find medullary cord and medullary sinuses. Finally, the lymphatics coming into the lymph node will be sieved and checked, and then finally will be drained out by the efferent lymphatic vessels. As you can see here, we have outer connective tissue covering, which we call capsule, and those efferent vessels leaving the lymph node area, the whole area is called hilum. It has got cortex and medulla. So this is the photomicrograph of the lymph nodes. And now, as we can see here in the medullary sinus, we can see the lymphocytes inside the lymph node, and we can see the macrophages. These are the cells from the immune system, and therefore we said lymph node is the intersection between lymphatic system and the immune system. So from lymph node, efferent lymphatic vessels will come out, and finally these efferent lymphatic vessels will merge together to become lymphatic trunk. So these lymphatic trunks, depending on their drainage area from the abdomen, aorta, pelvis, and lower limb, they will finally become lumbar lymphatic tract. It is a pair structure. There will be right and left lumbar lymphatic trunk. And they are taking all the lymphatics from the aortic region, abdominal region, pelvis region, and lower limb. And those coming from the stomach, intestine, digestive tract will finally become intestinal lymph trunk, which is unpaired. It is only one. From the thorax lymphatics, they will become bronchomediastinal. Of course, right side of the thorax, right lungs and left lung, and therefore they will be paired. And for the upper limb, neck, upper thorax, so we have right upper limb, left upper limb, left upper thorax, and right upper thorax, and right side of the neck and left side of the neck, as we have seen in our very first diagram. They will finally become subclavian lymph trunk. Of course, we have right and left because we color coded with green and pink color. Therefore, they are paired. And jugular for the right side of the head and left side of the head and neck, and therefore jugular lymphatic trunk. They are paired. So now finally if it became from the capillary level, now we get to the stage where the lymph vessels become much larger and they are forming the lymph trunk. So now lymph trunk will merge together to form the lymphatic ducts. So as we remember, the left side of the body, like head and neck, upper limb, thorax, and the rest of the body, they drain in only final one deck, and that is called thoracic deck. So all the lymphatic trunks will combine together on the left head and neck, left head and neck, left upper limb, left upper thorax, and the rest of the body. They will all combine together to form the left lymphatic deck, which is called the thoracic deck. Thoracic deck starts as a union of the right and left lumbar and intestinal lymph trunk at the level of lumbar 1 and 2 region. At the beginning, there is a bulging area when it starts, and that area is called cisterna chyli. And finally, it will drain, it will receive multiple tributaries of lymphatic trunks, and it enters into the junction between the left internal jugular vein and left subclavian vein. As we remember, right upper quadrant of the body is different. They will go separately into right jugular vein, subclavian vein, right bronchomediastinal trunk, independently, or into the neck veins. Or they might join to form right lymphatic deck, which is pretty short, or they will just like drain into the right subclavian or right internal jugular vein. So that's the way, it will just drain into the nearby large veins on the right side of the head and neck, right upper thoracic region, and right upper limb region. So now let's look at cisterna chyli here, which is cisterna chyli. It is a union of right and left lumbar lymphatic trunk and the intestinal trunk here. At the beginning, it is slightly bulged, and that area is called cisterna chyli. And cisterna chyli will continue as thoracic deck, which is running here, just anterior to the vertebral column, and finally it will drain into the junction between the right and left internal jugular vein and left subclavian vein. Along its course, it will receive multiple lymphatic tributaries, which will enter into the thoracic deck. Here, I want you to appreciate a venous system, which we call azygous venous system. So I want you to appreciate two veins here on either side of the thoracic deck, which are just lying in front of the vertebral column. This is the azygous vein. What do you mean by azygous? Azygous, it is a Greek word, which is single or individual. So you can see the azygous system, azygous vein, which is running on the right side of the vertebral column. And you can see the hemiazygous vein here, hemiazygous veins, which are taking blood from the thoracic wall, like you can see, which are the veins draining the intercostal veins, draining the thoracic wall, and they will be coming into the hemiazygous on the left side. And this hemiazygous vein will finally drain into the azygous vein. So this is the azygous venous system. That's what I want you to appreciate, which is just in the thoracic wall. But let's move on with our lymphatic system. So now you can appreciate the cisterna chyli, which is the combination of the right lumbar trunk, left lumbar trunk, and the intestinal trunk. at the beginning of the thoracic duct, it is large, and therefore the name called cisterna chyli, and that will continue as thoracic duct. And you can see the azygous vein here. So this is the picture, which is showing the different stages of lymphedema. Lymphedema, what does it mean? It means blockage or insufficient lymphatic system, and therefore the lymph cannot be carried from the periphery to the systemic circulation into the venous system. And that is the mild stage, slightly large leg comparing to the right side, much bigger, much bigger. And look at this. This is like a elephant leg. Therefore, they can be called elephantiasis. So yes, there are many reasons for a person to get lymphedema, which is the result of the insufficient lymphatic system. There are two types, primary lymphedema and secondary lymphedema. Primary lymphedema, which is very rare, a person is born with the incompetent lymphatic system, or the valves might not be functional, and therefore lymphatic cannot be drained, or there's some lymph node might not be present, or that sort of stuff, which is very rare. And the more common lymphatic insufficiency is secondary lymphedema. For example, like after the major breast cancer operation, or even with the breast cancer, the malignant cells, we block the lymph nodes and lymphatic flow. We have backward pressure and lymphatics cannot be drained properly. Like 2 in 10 people with breast cancer, we see secondary lymphedema. Half of the vulvar cancer patient, we have lymphedema, and 3 in 10 people with penis cancer, we have lymphedema. So now we see a lymph node, which is in the cervical region, cervical lymph node and enlargement, cervical lymphadenopathy. If they are significant enough in size, or if they have significant number of lymph node enlargement, I want you to be cautious, and I want you to think why this lymph node is enlarged and what is the cause of it. I'm going to take a break here. I want you to go back to the previous slide. I want you to digest, and once you are ready, we will. So I hope you have enough time to revise, and let's move on to the next stage. Let's start talking about immune system. Immune system is important for fight against diseases. It recognizes and it attacks the specific foreign molecules. Foreign mean anything other than self. The key defense cells of the immune system is lymphocytes. And lymphocytes are found in lymphoid tissue, lymphoid organs. Lymphoid organs will be thymus, bone marrow. Lymphoid tissue will be spleen, lymph nodes, and other lymphoid tissue are present just underneath the mucosa. So let's try to understand the immune system first. So before we go to the immune system, let's start with the body defense mechanism. So body defense mechanism, so every one of us has defense mechanism. We all have either non-specific or specific defense mechanism. We all have both specific and non-specific defense mechanism. Non-specific defense mechanism for us is number one, barrier, like our skin, which is our mucous membrane, which is a physical barrier. The chemicals inside our body, such as gastric acid, skin secretion, digestive enzymes, they all have some degree of chemical action to foreign materials. The complement system, which will help the phagocytosis or antibody. This is non-specific defense mechanism in our body. And when it comes to specific defense mechanism, we can split into natural and artificial. Natural specific defense mechanism, like we have built from our body, and artificial specific defense mechanism would be like something like vaccines, our COVID vaccine. Let's say COVID vaccine or any immunization vaccination, we are trying to develop artificial, but very specific, very particular to that virus or bacteria. We are trying to build the defense mechanism. So we have specific, under the specific defense mechanism, we have natural and artificial. Of course, they will both use antibody-mediated system and cell-mediated system. Antibody-mediated means they will be acting through the B lymphocytes, and cell-mediated, they will be acting through the T lymphocytes. So let's go and study about these things. So lymphoid organs, as we said, is present in many different parts of the body. If you can see here, the thymus gland, which is at the base of the neck behind the sternum, and the bone marrow here, red bone marrow. These organs, they and look at that here, around the mouth oral cavity, tonsils, around the nasal oral cavity and nasal cavity, we have the tonsils here, and even around the gastrointestinal tract, there are aggregated lymphoid tissue in the small intestine. Appendix has got multiple lymphoid tissue, and our spleen also play a lymphoid organ. So lymphoid organs can be divided into primary lymphoid organs and secondary lymphoid organs. Primary lymphoid organs, they will produce and they will mature the B cell and T cells. So for example, bone marrow and thymus gland. Bone marrow and thymus gland will produce lymphocyte, and they will educate and let the T lymphocyte to mature or B lymphocyte to mature, and therefore they are called primary lymphoid organs. In secondary lymphoid organs, their function is to store the immunocompetent lymphocytes. They do not have ability to produce, they do not have ability to educate the lymphocytes. Their function is just to store the lymphocyte. They will be spleen, lymph nodes, nodules, tonsils, small intestine, and appendix. Let's talk about infection, and let's talk about antigen. What is antigen? Antigen is anything foreign to the body, anything foreign to the self. So these antigen could be protein, glycoprotein, which is present in bacterial cell wall or any foreign plasma membrane, or protein secreted by the foreign cell. Anything non-self is antigen. They are made of protein, glycoprotein. And the body defends with the macrophage and lymphocytes. So where do we get lymphocytes from? They originate from the bone marrow and thymus gland. They are produced from the bone marrow, and they will mature in the bone marrow, or they will mature in the thymus gland. So these lymphocytes, either B or T lymphocytes, together with macrophages, they will defend the body against the antigen. Each lymphocyte will recognize and attack the specific antigen. What is a lymphocyte? Lymphocyte is a subtype of white blood cells. There are three types of lymphocytes: T lymphocyte, B lymphocyte, and natural killer cells. At the moment, just try to remember as natural killer cells. So now if you look at this diagram, our bone marrow will produce lymphocyte. The bone marrow need to be red bone marrow, and they will produce lymphocytes. Some lymphocytes will remain in the bone marrow, and they will mature into B lymphocytes. Some lymphocytes will go to the thymus gland, and they will be mature and educated as T lymphocytes. And finally, both B lymphocyte and T lymphocytes will enter into the immune system, and they will be stored in the lymph node, they will be stored in the secondary lymphoid organ, and they will help with the immune system, immune attack. So now we can see the lymph node, which are storing B lymphocyte and T lymphocytes, they will go and attack the invading antigen in two different ways. So let's go and look at how do these lymphocytes defend our body against these antigens. So now this is T lymphocyte and this is B lymphocyte. If you look at T lymphocyte will go and attach to the target cell, which contains invading foreign protein, which we call antigen. And then T lymphocyte will secrete protein that will damage the cell. And finally, T lymphocyte will detach and back out. And now this cell, which contains antigen, has protein which is secreted from the T lymphocyte, and that cell will die. So that is the action of T lymphocyte. So what is the action of B lymphocyte? B lymphocytes will give rise to plasma cell. Hey, look at that plasma cell derived from the B lymphocyte. B plasma cell, they will secrete antibodies, as you can see, and that antibodies will go and bind the bacteria, which is the foreign bacteria. And finally, this bacterium, which is binding with antibody, as you can see here, surface antigen of the bacteria bind with the antibodies produced from the plasma cell. These combination will be phagocytosed by the macrophage. So now this is a little bit closer look of the T lymphocyte action. And we have a few other types of T lymphocytes, which are called cytotoxic T lymphocyte and help. Natural killer cells, they do not recognize specific antigen. They act as T cells. They do not act as B cells. They kill tumor cells without any priming or prior activation. So there is no need to be previous activation. And this natural killer cells, natural means they just spontaneous. They will go and act. If there is any foreign tumor cell, they will go and attack it. And the role it plays a role in immunity against viruses and immune surveillance of the tumor. So lymphoid organs primary lymphoid organ and secondary lymphoid organs. Secondary lymphoid organs will be lymph node, spleen, and mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, which are the lymphoid tissue present just underneath the mucosa. So respiratory mucosa, the oral mucosa, or gastrointestinal tract mucosa. Let's look at the thymus gland. Thymus gland is bilobed. It is behind the sternum. It contains multiple lobules, as to the same like our lymph node. It has got outer cortex and inner medulla with surrounding capsule. And as we have learned, the thymus, inside the thymus, the T lymphocyte precursor, which are still not immunocompetent enough, they come into the thymus gland and they will become immunologically competent T lymphocytes. So inside the thymus glands, we do have epithelial cells for the maturation of these lymphocytes. There will be less or no reticular cells. And these thymus glands, they are keeping the immature lymphocytes. The structure has tried to prevent immature lymphocyte not to get being stimulated by the antigen, and therefore there is a barrier between the blood, which might carry antigen, and the thymus gland, where there is the immuno-incompetent premature lymphocytes exist. Of course, finally, once there is the maturation and the T lymphocyte become immunologically competent, they will be secreted. The size of the thymus gland will change with age. Look at the thymus gland here. It is just at the base of the neck, just underneath the sternum. And it has got right lobe and left lobe. It is in the superior mediastinum, so we say. Spleen is supplied by the splenic artery and drained by the splenic vein. It is a site of lymphocyte proliferation, and it is the organ for immune surveillance and response. Its functions are removing the debris, which could be antigen or debris from the blood, and remove the age defective RBC and platelet from the blood. It has got white pulp and red pulp. White pulp is for related to immune system, and red pulp is to disposal of red blood cells. So now let's look at the spleen. This is the spleen here, and this is a large tortuous artery, which we call splenic artery. So this splenic artery originates from the celiac artery, which is the one of the large branch of the abdominal aorta, and we have to study about that artery when we go to the gastrointestinal tract. And as you can see, the spleen is very close to the pancreas, and in fact, the tail of the pancreas could enter and hide in the hilum of the spleen. So now if we split the spleen in half, we will see the white pulp and red pulp. Red pulp is for disposal of RBC, and white pulp is for lymphocyte, which is the subtype of white blood cell. That's the way we should remember. Let's talk about mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT, M-A-L-T. These are specialized connected lymphoid tissue. They contain lymphocytes. And lymphoid tissue, they are strategically lying around the body entrances. For example, like around the oral cavity or around the nasal cavity. So these are the entrances for the bacteria into our body. They are tonsils, Peyer's patches in the intestine, and appendix. So let's look at the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue of the small intestine. They are present in the mucous membrane lining of the small intestine, just underneath the mucous membrane. And tonsils, like as we can see here, palatine tonsil, lingual tonsil, pharyngeal tonsil, and tuber tonsil, they are all lying around the passage of the nasal cavity coming into the larynx and trachea and around the oral cavity. So these are the lymphoid tissues which are guarding against the invading pathways, possible invading pathways. So now we have come close to the end of the lecture, and I want you to take a break before we move on to the next slides, which are more like applied anatomy and physiology for the lymphatic system. Now, I hope you have enough break. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is the cancer of the glands of the penis. So once we see that, we need to check the lymphatics, because lymphatics is our body defense mechanism. Once there is cancer, the body defense, including the lymphatic system, will go and guard and go and fight against this cancer. And we need to know the draining lymph nodes of the glands of the penis. The same thing like vulvar vagina cancer or infection. Where do the lymphatic goes? Of course, if we look at that here, it will go to the superficial inguinal lymph nodes, or it will go into the deep inguinal lymph nodes. And finally, from these lymph nodes will drain into the pelvic lymph nodes. So that means if we have a problem with the vulva, vagina, or the glands of the penis, we should be looking the lymph node enlargement, either superficial or deep or pelvic lymph nodes. So again, the same, like if you see someone with the enlarged lymph node, and if it is significant enough, of course, we cannot worry every lymph adenopathy, every lymph node enlargement. And therefore, I said significant lymph adenopathy. What do we mean by significant lymph adenopathy? I mean, generally, it is regarded as any lymph node size bigger than 1 centimeter or multiple lymph nodes being involved, or some lymph nodes where they are present in particular area such as supraclavicular region, popliteal region, iliac lymph nodes, or epitrochlear lymph node. They don't need to be large as 1 centimeter. If they are larger than 5 millimeter, then we might consider these as significant lymph adenopathy. And therefore, if any significant lymph adenopathy, we need to check, could it be part of the lymphatic organ problem, such as lymphoma or lymphadenitis, or any primary, any secondary lymph node enlargement. Secondary means the cancer is somewhere and that draining lymph nodes are being affected and presenting to us. So this is the page from the Sun newspaper from United Kingdom. Like these women, they are all standing up to fight cancer. And if we look at that, you can see the nipple in this lady has been taken away. And you can see in this lady, both breasts, bilateral mastectomy, removal of the breast. You can see the scar was on the left and on the right side. And this lady's scar might not be as bad as here. And because of these surgical scars, surgical operation with the dissection of the lymph node, especially in the axillary region, because breast we drain to the axillary lymph node group, then they might have disruption of the axillary lymph node and they might get lymphedema in the upper arm. So now if we look at that, the axillary lymph node group, then this is the pectoralis minor muscle, as we all know. And you can see the lymph node groups just distal to the pectoralis minor, just posterior to the pectoralis minor and proximal to the pectoralis minor. And you can see the proximity of these lymph nodes with the nerves here. So this is the breast lymphatic drainage, which is draining into the lateral lymph node, central lymph node. Finally, they will go into the apical lymph node. And this is deltopectoral lymph node. And therefore, if we have to remove these lymph nodes, they are draining tributaries such as the arm and the whole upper limb, we get lymphatic insufficiency. So now these are the possible questions for the MCQ exam. Now we have come to the end of the lymphatic and immune system lecture.